Now, after opening statements, each attorney will call 2 witnesses who will be subject to cross-examination. Then, each side will make closing statements. Afterwards, the jury will rule on the case. And if the defendants are found guilty, I will impose the judgment. You will listen carefully to the opening statements and the witnesses, and at the end of the hearing, you will be required to determine whether there is sufficient evidence beyond a reasonable doubt and that Ms. Lee and her union followers are responsible for public malfeasance. Is that understood, jury? Mr. Moore, you may begin your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you very much for being here. When I read the title of this trial, Public Unions, Are They Good or Bad for America?, I thought this must be a trick question. I think there's no question. You will find that the evidence shows that public employee unions are very bad for the U.S. economy, and I think that we will show you in the next 45 minutes to an hour that the unions are guilty.
I'm going to need a bench to rule from, so I'm going to have to ask you to step over here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. We will show the prosecution that public employee unions are guilty of 3 charges. Number 1, public employee unions have become a scourge on our U.S. economy and are making us poorer as a result. Number 2, public employee unions are responsible for the bankrupting of virtually every state and local government in America. Number 3, from Albany to San
Order in the court, please.
Number 3, public employee unions are guilty of causing one of the greatest income inequality injustices in American history. The injustice and the inequality is the inequality of pay between what public employee unions receive and private sector workers that are comparably skilled. And we will provide evidence for you that shows that the average private sector worker in America receives only half of what a public sector employee unions get. We hear from liberals all the time that there is injustice and unfairness in America, and I would make the case to you, ladies and gentlemen, and I think we will show you the evidence that the greatest injustice and greatest unfairness is this disparity in incomes between what the public sector unions receive and the private sector unions. And that is something that is causing higher taxes on all of us. Now, if you look, I had an article in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago that was called Makers versus Takers, and I think it really exemplifies what is wrong in America with the growth of the power and the size of the unions in America. And let me just give you one statistic to document how public sector employee unions are taking over America. If you go back to 1965, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will find that in America there were twice as many manufacturing workers in America as there were public sector union employees in the United States. By 1995, there were exactly the same number of public employee unions members as there were manufacturers. Today in America, and this is a sad commentary on what has happened to our economy, there are twice as many government workers today as there are manufacturers. There are twice as many takers in the American economy as makers, and ladies and gentlemen, that is a trend that is simply unsustainable in America today. One last point I would like to make is that we have not talked yet about the real evil empire of the U.S. economy. And I think you all know who I am talking about. The teachers' unions in America are ruining our schools. They are bankrupting our schools, and we have got to do something about freeing the kids from the public teachers' unions in America. One example of the injustice that public teacher unions impose on our economy. Today in states like Ohio, just take one example, they have a policy called retire and rehire. A teacher at the age of 53, 54, or 5 can earn a salary of $100,000, retire from that job with a $100,000 a year pension, and then, ladies and gentlemen, get rehired for that same job at the old salary, taking home $200,000. Nobody in the private sector gets that kind of deal, and that's the kind of things that is taking away money from the classroom so we have better schools in America. And so I think in sum, ladies and gentlemen, you will find by the end of this hour that the public sector employees are guilty as charged, and the American economy and every state and local government and the federal government would be much more fiscally healthy if we did not have public employee unions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Counselor. Please, no applause. There will be order in this court. This is a courtroom, and I expect to have order in my courtroom. Now, thank you, Counselor. Thea Lee, we'll now hear from Thea Lee. She is a Deputy Chief of Staff Policy Director and Chief International Economist at the AFL-CIO. She earned her bachelor's degree from Smith College and a master's degree in economics from the University of Michigan. Ms. Lee is co-author of A Field Guide to the Global Economy. She is an expert on the North American Free Trade Agreement, international trade, wage inequality, and the steel and textile industries. She's appeared on numerous national television and radio shows. She is also on the board of directors of Worker Rights Consortium, United for the Fair Economy, and the National Bureau of Economic Research. Ms. Lee, will you give your opening statement, please?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the jury and assembled audience. I submit to you that the charges against my client, the public unions of America, and the hard-working men and women who belong to them are utterly baseless and should be thrown out of this court. The prosecution's case is founded on shoddy statistics, isolated and unrepresentative anecdotal evidence, and a false premise. Moreover, I will demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that my client has been unfairly scapegoated and is being blamed for crimes that were in fact committed by another party entirely. The prosecution is well aware of this fact, and I submit to you that the prosecution has an unseemly, and I might even say intimate, relationship with the true culprit. The entire case against my client is a smokescreen to divert attention from the true perpetrator of the crimes at issue today: the collapse of the U.S. economy, the destruction of the American middle class, and the state budget shortfalls. My clients could not be present in the courtroom this evening, but if they were here, I have no doubt that you would find them to be an extremely sympathetic group. They are your neighbors, your family, your friends. They teach your children. They care for your elderly parents. They keep your local library open, and they pick up your garbage. They were the ones who walked back into the burning building on 9/11. They're the ones who throw their body in front of violent criminals. Many of them literally risk their lives every single day to keep you and your family safe. The question in front of us tonight is, do these hardworking Americans deserve to exercise their basic human freedom to form a union if they so choose, and to bargain collectively with their employer for decent wages and benefits, a dignified and secure retirement, and a safe workplace? My case tonight rests on 3 key points. First, that it is a basic human freedom for workers to join together at their workplace and to have a voice on the job. The government should not deny workers this freedom. And every decent democratic government recognizes the right of workers to form unions, and it is totalitarian and dictatorships that are afraid of workers having a voice at the job. The second point, it is good for the U.S. economy and essential to the survival of the American middle class that public sector workers have decent wages and decent benefits. There is overwhelming empirical evidence that public sector workers are not, in fact, overcompensated compared to their counterparts in the private sector. Once you take into account the different levels of education, of skill, and years of experience. In fact, many studies show that public sector workers are underpaid relative to private sector workers by at least 4%. Third, public sector workers and their unions are not to blame for the fiscal troubles of state and local governments, nor for the underfunding of their own pensions. There is absolutely no correlation between those states where public sector workers have collective bargaining rights and strong unions and state fiscal troubles. In fact, states that allow public sector collective bargaining recently had 14% deficits relative to their budget, compared to those states where public sector collective bargaining was not allowed. They had a 16.5% budget deficit on average. Many of the states with the biggest problems with their pensions and the biggest problems with their deficits don't allow public sector collective bargaining and have very weak unions, like Texas, North Carolina, and Nevada. What then accounts for the ballooning state budget deficits? Any reputable economist can tell you the deep recession that began in 2008...
Ms. Lee, you're making a speech. I need you to make an opening statement.
Yes, sir, Your Honor. Of course, Your Honor. The deep recession that began in 2008, the stock market crash, the collapse of the housing market, were to blame for the troubles that state budgets are having, not the workers and their unions. Rising health care costs affect both private and public sector workers. Again, not the fault of the unions. In fact, unions can and do deliver significant benefits, not just to their members, but to their communities and to the economy overall. Teachers bargain for smaller class size so that kids can learn. Nurses bargain for a reasonable and responsible patient load so that their patients can get the care they deserve. Firefighters and police need safe conditions so that they can provide the protections for their communities. Richard Florida of the Martin Prosperity Institute, the University of Toronto Business School, found that union density is, in fact, if you look state by state, states with a higher union density actually have higher incomes, more education, and more creative work, not the opposite. And internationally, that holds up as well. The countries with the highest unionization have higher productivity, less inequality, and lower unemployment. Public sector workers have been dragged through the mud to distract you, the American people, from the truly guilty party and the economic problems that we are facing today. Wall Street, big business, multinational corporations gambled with our future, turned our economy into a giant casino, sent our jobs offshore, and now they want to blame hardworking nurses, teachers, firefighters, and police officers for the damage they wrought. This is what America is all about. You work hard all your life. You play by the rules. You take care of your neighbors and your community. You take pride in your work. You deserve decent schools for your kids, a safe neighborhood, and a dignified retirement. My client is not guilty of all charges. Instead of putting these hardworking people on trial, we should be thanking them for the hard work they do and for the modest pay. We should redirect our justified anger at the collapse of the U.S. economy toward the truly guilty party, Wall Street and big business. That, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is who should be going to jail. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Mr. Moore, please call your first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to call to the witness stand Mr. John Mackey.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, no applause. This is a courtroom.
Mr. Mackey, will you swear on this Whole Foods apple to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
How do I know that's really a Whole Foods apple?
Because Dr. Skousen went to Whole Foods and told me he bought it.
We'll stipulate that it's a Whole Foods apple.
I do.
Mr. Mackey, thank you for being here. Let me start by asking you this question. You are the CEO and president of Whole Foods. How many employees do you have around the country?
I think about 61,000.
61,000. So of those 61,000, would you say that you are an employer that provides your employees with a fair wage and a fair benefit? And could you describe a little bit the wages and benefits that you provide for your workers?
Well, the average wage is, I think, $16.50 an hour. The benefits are extensive, fully provided health care, food discounts, retirement benefits. It's very generous. We've been named one of the 100 best companies to work for by Fortune magazine for 14 consecutive years.
And how many of your employees are members of a union?
None that I'm aware of.
So you are not a unionized shop. And let me ask you this question, sir. Why? Why don't you have a union at Whole Foods?
Because the team members haven't felt that they needed union representation.
So you believe that the performance of the company would suffer, and what do you think that a union would do for the workers? Do you think they would benefit from that, or would be harmed?
I do not think they'd be benefited by it, no.
Now, let me ask you this question. If a union were forced upon you, if Whole Foods had to have unionized workers, what do you think that would do to your competitiveness and your cost structure as a company in a very competitive industry?
I think it would be harmful competitively. I mean, every industry that I'm aware of that's been heavily unionized begins to decline in its competitiveness. We feast upon our unionized competitors as a general rule. They don't have as good a service, they don't have as good a quality, they don't seem to work as hard. So it's competitive disadvantage generally to be unionized.
Have your workers ever attempted to unionize?
Yes, our Madison, Wisconsin store unionized for 1 year, and then they decertified the union a year later.
And what happened in that instance? The workers
voted for union representation, and then they changed their minds.
So the reason you're not unionized is not because you don't want a union, but your workers have chosen not to have a union. Is that correct?
It's illegal in the United States to prevent unionization. If they wish to have a union, they would be free to elect one, but so far they haven't chosen to do so.
Let me ask you one more question, sir. Given that the studies are showing that public sector employee unions are paid substantially higher than what a comparable private sector worker receives, and we'll provide evidence of that in a few minutes. But given that, you have this premium in wages and benefits that are paid to public employee unions, do you think that's fair that one of your workers who's paid $16 or $18 or $20 an hour should have to pay higher taxes to pay for benefits and salaries that are much more generous for comparably skilled workers in the public sector?
I don't think, in my opinion, I don't think in the private sector where you have competition, unions can serve a useful purpose sometimes. But in the public sector where government's a monopoly, the public service unions, I think, don't have that competition to keep them in check. And as a result, I think they've done great damage. So I don't think public service unions should be legal.
Thank you, sir.
All right, Ms. Lee, your witness.
My partner, Mr. Shoemaker, is going to...
That'll be fine. Please proceed.
Mr. Mackey, my name is Carl Shoemaker. I'm a professor of history and law at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Mr. Moore brought out an example of the very impressive job that you've done in building and leading Whole Foods, and it's quite commendable, and I want to commend you on that. What I'd like to do is just ask you a couple of hypothetical situations and get your expert opinion, having worked all the years that you have with Whole Foods, on how you would assess these kinds of situations. So I want you to imagine, I know you would never do this, but I want you to imagine for a moment that you today issued a directive to your company and said, from this day forward, no employee at Whole Foods will ever get a raise higher than the cost of living allowance in a given year. We'll tag it to the consumer price index, and no one will get a raise above that. Can you tell me, in your expert opinion, what that would do to your competitiveness?
That would be very harmful to our competitiveness.
I imagine that it would. I'd like to imagine another hypothetical situation, again, something I know you would never engage in, but let's imagine that you've entered into a contract with an employee or a group of employees that involved a range of things: compensation, salary, health care, benefits, all the things that you said you provide. Imagine at the end of the year, due to, say, a contraction in the economy, some unforeseen capital expenditures, you decided that you weren't going to make that contractually agreed upon contribution to, say, a pension. You just decided not to do it. You explain the circumstances to your employees under which you had to make such a decision, and then you don't make that contribution. What do you think the results would be for your company?
It would be bad for morale.
Not only that, it could even implicate some legal problems as well.
Possibly be illegal, and therefore we'd be sued, and there might be negative consequences.
Yeah, indeed. You could incur legal obligations. That's right. Would it surprise you if I told you that all of the scenarios I just described, while illegal in the private sector, whether unionized or not, are actually permissible under law for public employees?
Nothing you could tell me regarding what goes on at the government would surprise me.
Very well put. Very well put. And given precisely that uncertainty which you just described, given precisely the unpredictability of government and the dangers that it can pose in certain circumstances, why would you take away from public employees the right to unionize to protect themselves against exactly those kinds of arbitrary encroachments?
The reason why I would take it away is because there's essentially no competition. A company is, in a sense, the unions compete for the hearts and minds of the workers in the private sector. And if you don't do a good job of taking care of your employees, you run the risk of unionization. On the other hand, the check on the unions is competition. If the unions ask for too much, then you'll be at a competitive disadvantage. The public sector doesn't have that competitive disadvantage because they can continue to go back to the taxpayers for more money. That's exactly what we've seen happen.
No further questions, John.
You may step down, Mr. Mackey. All right. Let's call our next witness.
Less money